There we go. All right, so I changed the title of the presentation to Fables of the Driverless Revolution. And the reason for that is because I think there is going to be a driverless revolution. These technologies are going to change the way we all travel, particularly in cities. But the fables part is because literally everything that you have been told in the media, on blogs, wherever it is you get your information about the future is wrong. They're myths. And in fact, this idea of self-driving, or I like to kind of break it down into its two parts, self-propelled and self-guided vehicles. We've had self-propelled vehicles for over 100 years. They're called automobiles. It's the self-guided part that's new. This is our oldest technological dream. Every mythic tradition on the planet has some god or hero, or in this case, the Shah, Kai Kavas, in Persian legend, who has some kind of self-propelled, self-driving, self-guided vehicle. In his case, it was a throne that was carried by 4 eagles across Asia. You go to Slavic mythology and the tale of Baba Yaga the witch, who runs around the Eurasian steppes in a hut that has chicken legs that it's carried upon. And in Scandinavia, Frey, the god of nature, has a little teeny magic ship, or it's a full-size ship, but he can fold it up and stick it in his pocket. So, you know, these vehicles sort of, they go in the heavens, they go on the seas, but an awful lot of them actually move on the ground. They're sort of the precursors to what we're imagining in the driverless vehicles of tomorrow. Now, as soon as the automobile comes along, it doesn't take very long before people realize that driving sucks. And we need to find ways to make machines that will do this for us. And before cars, you could fall asleep on your horse, and the horse would keep going. It would drive itself. There's a whole set of stories from the 19th century about, you know, what would happen, the crazy situations that cart drivers and drivers would end up in after having fallen asleep after a long shift at the wheel. And, you know, the horse would go to the apple farm and park itself and eat some apples, or end up in the next town beyond where they wanted to go to. So we've really wanted this technology for a long time. This is the first remote-controlled vehicle, American Wonder, which was demonstrated in the 20s in New York City on a drive down Broadway. And it didn't go very well. You know, this is a prototype, and it kind of went out of control a couple times. And the last time it went out of control, it actually crashed into the car that was carrying the press photographers who were recording the event. So the first self-driving car demonstration did not go well. After that, I think it became very clear, and it's been clear for most of the 20th century, that having the car remote controlled didn't really help anybody, because someone still had to drive it, just not in the car. It was a great gimmick, but it wasn't really a practical solution. And we didn't have computers, or we didn't have computers that were fast enough. So no one ever imagined that the car would be smart enough to drive itself. So there was a lot of attention on smart roads. And we see the first public illustration of the idea of an automated highway just before World War II in 1938 in Popular Science. And this is sort of the early thinking about the interstate highway system in the US, which to this day is the largest public works project in the history of the United States. So the idea of automated vehicles was very much not just a corporate endeavor, but actually a public endeavor that involved government and industry working closely. And it sort of reaches its peak of expression in 1956 with GM's Motorama film, which I love because, not only because they called it autopilot, which some of you may know Tesla has now commandeered. I think what Tesla did was they got rid of the space in autopilot, and so I don't know, I guess that got them past the copyright. But you know, this is a really kind of uncanny prediction of not just the kinds of technologies that the auto industry is bringing today, but actually how they work by using cameras to find the painted lane markings on the road, and then a computer to understand those markings and guide the vehicle. And this is kind of a great space age vision of what the future might look like. Now, what's actually happened with automated vehicles as the technology has become less sci-fi and more realistic is that we've come more and more. You heard during the introduction that the world's population is mostly urban now. Even 20, 30 years ago, we still thought that there was going to be room for more automobiles. And what's happened is that the roads have filled up, one after another, in every city around the world. If we spent 60 years from 1920 to 1980 in a process of motorization, we spent the last 40 years from 1980 to 2020 in a period of saturation. Going forward, we're going to be in an era of automation. If you look back at sort of these early modern images of what the future might be like, they're indeed very suburban. This was an important demonstration in the late 90s in the United States called Demo 97. It showed kind of a future of Southern California of single passenger vehicles, fully automated, and in about a second you're going to see somebody reading the paper as they cruise along the highway, which is kind of funny because nobody reads newspapers anymore, right? We all get our news on the internet. Thank God nobody drives cars this ugly anymore either, but this was really a seminal moment in the quest for automated vehicles. And in fact, many of the people that are working in the companies that are building these technologies now cut their teeth on this project in the 90s. So again, an industry that talks so much, almost has a libertarian view of how innovation happens, got its start with federal government funding. 10 years later, we see the Pentagon getting involved in a series of contests called the DARPA Grand Challenges to explore and accelerate the development of this technology for military use. And they staged a bunch of races in the desert. The first one was a disaster. Nobody really finished. They had teams from universities and car companies compete. The second one, they finished. The third one, they moved it to this abandoned Air Force base in Victorville. And this was supposed to be the urban challenge. We wanted to see not if these driverless vehicles could navigate cross-country, but if they could navigate inside a built community, a built environment. And this is where the MIT car gets rear-ended by the Carnegie Mellon car. So we had our first automated road wreck in this. But what's interesting about this is that we're already seeing, even before it's commercialized, automated vehicles having to deal with the complexity of the world that we live in. And this was, 1,000 times more complicated than driving through the desert. And then zoom forward another 10 years, and this is Audi's promotional vision of one of their automated vehicle features. And we see this beautiful SUV kind of leave a lovely suburban home, head into the city, and 20 years ago, automated driving was on empty roads, no buildings in sight. And now automated driving is basically take you into the city and get stuck in traffic. And this is really an acceptance that the world is crowded and automated vehicles need to deal with all of that congestion. It's a real shift and it's a real maturing of our thinking about this technology. The final shift that's happened really just in the last couple of years is from automation to autonomy. And the idea that now there's enough computing power. Computers are cheap and powerful and small and enough to put inside vehicles so that we don't need smart roads. We don't need to fund infrastructure. And the price of public action, getting people to agree to build that infrastructure, disappears. And industry can just essentially retool and spit these things out, and we'll get our upgrade that's been long promised. And this really kind of reaches its peak in a 2014 video that Google released, which showed not just able-bodied people, people working, people old enough to know how to drive a car, getting the benefits of this technology, but people who were never able to drive in the first place or are no longer able to drive safely. Senior citizens, disabled people, visually impaired people. At the time this video was made, there was something like 500,000 people in California alone who were not fully able-bodied other than the fact that they were visually impaired and couldn't get a driver's license. And the idea here was, okay, here's 500,000 people who can all of a sudden live independently and live productive lives as full members of society. Isn't this a wonderful thing? And this is really the thinking that I think has shaped so much of the discourse around automated vehicles, is that, basically all of our cars and all the problems that those cars represent will be replaced by this perfect version of the car. This one product, which is basically a little pod. I think the sarcastic term for the Google car was the koala car, because it kind of looked like a koala. But that idea has just become a meme now that has been regurgitated by designers all over the world and car companies. IDEO, which is a Silicon Valley think tank, has their version of the pod car that's transparent so you can see through it. I don't know what that does for it, but it looks cool. Volkswagen has proposed its version of the pod car called Cedric. And this is really the kind of stereotypical image of the driverless future, is all of us in identical cars driving in sort of synchronized harmony with no traffic down a road that moves freely and utterly safe. No more accidents. That's the biggest claim. And there are some kind of interesting side effects that could happen if we woke up tomorrow and all of our dirty, unsafe, traffic-causing automobiles were replaced by these computerized pod cars. We might be able to make them cheaply enough and dispatch them into places where they could help people who don't have access to automobiles. So we did a number of scenarios last year for Bloomberg Philanthropies in New York, which was Mayor Michael Bloomberg's foundation, to try to explore some of these ideas, how cities might take this technology and turn it to their own goals and needs. And so we imagined things like subsidized robo-taxi rides from food deserts to grocery stores where people could get access not to the fast food they have access to in a lot of poor inner city neighborhoods, but to healthy food. We imagined, kind of a continuation of what's happening today. When I landed at Pearson, I opened my Uber app, and there were 7 different kinds of services I could choose from. I could pick a big car. I could pick a shared car. I could, I don't think it had a green car, but they offer that somewhere, low-emission vehicles. They had assisted rides with people who were trained to deal with disabled people. They had wheelchair-ready cars. And as we start to explore what the opportunities are when we don't have to pay people to drive, right? So what can we do with that resource? And so this is sort of the first myth of the driverless revolution, is that driverless equals unmanned or uncrewed. And in fact, once you free that staff person or that crew up from driving, they could do all kinds of other things. So we imagined, robo-taxis that would take children around and be supervised, and those people would be bonded and have background checks. Or you can see here someone providing essentially outreach to isolated senior citizens to make sure that they're okay and they're getting the care they need and they're getting to their medical appointments on time, because we know that saves money and improves outcomes. And really, again, we're trying to get people to explore what the possibilities are when we really embrace this technology. And after doing this for a while, what I started to realize was how constrained we are by thinking about the driverless revolution as just fixing cars. And in fact, we're going to put automation in every kind of vehicle on Earth, and then we're going to invent new kinds of vehicles to exploit this capability. And there's a era in evolution of life on Earth about 500 million years ago called the Cambrian explosion, which was, for some geophysical reason I don't understand, all of a sudden there was a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere and the oceans, and life just exploded on Earth. The diversity of life, the number of species expanded rapidly. And I think that's what we're doing now, is we're introducing oxygen into the automotive system, and it's not just going to make this one species better, cleaner, safer, less congested. It's going to allow us to just infinitely riff on the idea of getting around on wheels. And so the rest of the talk, I'm just going to share with you some examples of vehicles that people are thinking about automating or already automating, and the kind of what-if questions about future cities that those technologies raise. So one of my absolute favorites are these little package bots. I call them conveyors, because I think they're basically like the buckets on a conveyor belt, except instead of going around inside a factory or a warehouse, they're going to be running down our sidewalks. And what you're looking at here is some TV footage from a test that took place last year in Washington, D.C. An Estonian company, the same people who brought you Skype, are backing this company called Starship Robotics. And really what they're trying to do is drive the cost of last mile delivery down to about 5 cents a mile, which would essentially make delivery free, instant delivery. There have been estimates of like how many of these would you need to serve, say, the entire continental United States, and it's about 1 million. And that's a lot of robots running around on our sidewalks. There's a whole another category of vehicles that's a little bit larger that they call mules, because they're able to carry more cargo. And the use for this, whereas the conveyor might bring your burrito or a bottle of wine to your house on demand, this vehicle might roll into your neighborhood in the morning with all the packages that are being shipped and essentially be like a package locker. You would go down and get your package and maybe send returns in there as well. And it would sort of park itself in your neighborhood. And this would be great because it would get a lot of dirty trucks off the streets. But even if these vehicles are able to replace a lot of the truck traffic, and I won't go through all the statistics about how fast e-commerce is growing. I'll just tell you how the story ends in 2050, which is that most projections are that 2/3 of what we buy in stores today will be bought online. So the majority of the retail economy will come to you in a box on a robot truck, as opposed to you're fetching it from a store or it's being brought to you by a human in a delivery van. And so companies have to solve this problem. They have to find a cheaper way to ship to you, and this is one of the main ways they're going to try to do it. So let's imagine that these conveyors clear all these, bike couriers and motorcycles and vans off the streets, but simply end up clogging sidewalks and curbs. And a lot of cities are worried about this right now. They're trying to understand, where do we provide places for all these new vehicles to move? They're not roadworthy enough to go in the travel lanes, but they're too robotic to go on the sidewalks. And so what we imagined was, maybe we need to bring people back into the equation in the last meter, not the last mile. Let the robot do the last mile from warehouse to curb, but then have porters, a kind of age-old urban profession, do that last meter and do all the hard work of helping you put things together or, install your speakers, selling extra services, possibly helping you recycle the packaging, which is not done nearly enough today as it ought to be, and creating jobs in the interim while not adding huge amounts of cost. So I think there's new opportunities, and we imagine that some cities will actually say, the curb is the key side of the city of e-commerce, and we need to regulate that the way we used to regulate our waterfronts. That's where the goods move in and out. Another technology I'm really excited about are what are called driverless shuttles. I think this is the Model T of the 21st century. I think this is, if you go south of the equator to any city, most people get around on they don't use their own cars, they don't use formal transit, they use informal transit, which is basically 8 to 12 passenger vehicles. And these things are already being automated. There's 2 French companies that make them. There's 2 American companies that are making them. I don't know if anyone's making them in Canada, but I think someone should get started. And as you see here, this is from Japan. Japan has a huge problem with aging rural population, and they're trying to figure out ways to get people who are not able to survive around a countryside that's very sparsely settled without bankrupting the country. And this is a problem that China's going to face in 20 years, Western Europe is facing now, and potentially North America. Well, you guys will be okay. In the US, we've decided we don't want immigration anymore, so our population is going to age very rapidly. But you're all right in Canada. So, but what's remarkable about it is that this can be done very cost effectively. It allows us to have transit-like services for a fraction of the cost. Now, if you combine driverless shuttles with what's going on in robotics, which is really amazing, that we've now pretty much figured out how to do hominid locomotion, so vehicles that can move the way animals move with their legs. This was originally developed for military purposes, but it will be commercialized soon. If anybody here has children or grandchildren who like Japanese anime, you'll recognize that if we combine driverless shuttles with hominid robots, we'll have the cat bus from Totoro, which is one of the most exciting transportation innovations of the future. It's a giant bus that's a cat. I'll let you just absorb that for a second. The best part is if you look at those 2 lights up top, the little purple ones, those are mice. So I think that's what makes the cat go, is that the mice are constantly driving him crazy. This is a wonderful movie for children, by the way, if you ever get a chance. This is just to give you a sense of how crazy the future could be. A few years ago, we didn't think that we would be able to develop robots that could walk on legs like animals and people do. And it's actually commonplace now in the labs. And it may be 10 or 20 years before it's commercialized, but it's possible now. It's not just science fiction. We thought a lot, too, about some of the ways that these driverless shuttle networks might form into transit systems over time, and imagine something we call a microtransit mesh. So once, we've replaced cars and buses with these tiny little shuttles, and we all are using phones or pressing a button on a street lamp like the woman in that video, it's very easy for these vehicles to self-organize and figure out that to get me from this side of Toronto to the other side of Toronto, these 2 buses should rendezvous and swap passengers. And so we sort of imagined a transit system evolving from the bottom up with these very small, efficient, electric, driverless vehicles. And again, challenging cities to think about what's possible. Now let's go to 2-wheeled vehicles, because this is where things start to get really crazy. This was a motorcycle that never came to market. It was called the LIT CR1. It was by a San Francisco startup that's long gone. But basically, it was an electric motorcycle with the same technology that's in the Segway scooter, if you ever saw that. It's a big gyroscope. So this is an electric motorcycle that couldn't tip over. I mean, they would T-bone this with a pickup truck, and instead of falling over and killing the rider, it would just skid sideways and stay standing. And in California, where it's legal to split the lanes in a traffic jam in a motorcycle, people immediately realized that this was like a shortcut to cruising around and cutting through the traffic. And it was using all of the technology of Silicon Valley to make the motorcycle from something that's dangerous and risky and hard to use in bad weather to something that would be a superior mode of getting around the city. Self-driving bicycles. This is an idea I've been excited about for a very long time. When I was a teenager, we used to do ghost riding. Anybody ever do ghost riding, where you're riding your bike and you hop off and you play a game where you see how far you can get it to go before it falls down? So I thought, when I first learned about automated vehicles, I thought self-driving bikes made a lot of sense. This was an April Fool's joke that came out of Google's Amsterdam office about 3 years ago. And you can see it get more and more ridiculous as it goes on. We'll see the kids going through Amsterdam traffic in just a minute. And I was fooled by this. I write about that in my forthcoming book, which will be about this topic next year. A lot of people were fooled by it. It's not a joke. There are research labs around the world working on self-driving bikes and self-driving scooters too. This is in Singapore just recently. And the reason why self-driving electric bikes and scooters are such a remarkable idea is because they solve all of the problems with dockless vehicle sharing, okay? Which is that the vehicles need to get recharged. They tend to get left sort of helter-skelter all over corners and sidewalks and crosswalks. There's a whole genre, if you go online, of things that people have done in Southern California, like public art sculptures that people have made with discarded bird scooters. So they'll take them, like 20 of them, and put them on a trash can. Or they'll like nail them like they're nailing them to the cross on the walls of buildings and stuff. People hate, except for the people that use them, people hate dockless vehicles. When they're self-driving, they can dock themselves in alleys, in garages that are now empty because we've all sold our cars. They can gather at dismissal when students are coming out of school. They can gather at transit stations and predictively deploy themselves. They can gather at 2 o'clock in the morning when it's last call outside the bar to make sure people don't get in their cars. Really unbelievable possibilities. And if you think about neighborhood design, the whole idea of transit-oriented development right now, the idea of clustering your development around rail stations and bus stations, has a very limited footprint because it's based on how far people are willing to walk from transit to their home. When you have these kind of devices, which are basically super-powered feet, you can expand that to 5 miles, and that's a 25 times increase in land area that then has access to the station. You have to completely rethink your assumptions about what a good neighborhood is because these are not for walking. They're for scooting. I think that's going to challenge a lot of people's assumptions. You're going to have to deal with it because these devices are designed and sold like iPhones. These companies go through iterations every 6 weeks of their bikes. They redesign them based on how they're performing and then have them drop shipped from China to your neighborhood. The automobile industry takes 6 years to put a new vehicle on the market. So it's a completely different world. A couple more examples. Road trains. During the Cold War, both the NATO and the Soviets used to use road trains like this to supply our Arctic bases. I don't know if you guys still drive them up to the north. Australia, they use them to move goods across the outback where there's no rail lines in some of the towns. So physically coupled vehicles. Well, automation technology is now being used to virtually couple vehicles, what they call platooning. And the trucking industry has been excited about this because you can save somewhere from 10 to 15% on the fuel bill by drafting one vehicle behind the other. So it doesn't have to push, they don't all have to push through the wind. There's potentially some safety improvements as well. And potentially you can get rid of drivers as well. And maybe just have one like flight engineer in the front vehicle. So this is an idea that's being explored. Well, can't we do that with passenger vehicles too? Could we create a road train to carry people that would just basically be like a really long bus? And this is something that is being tested in China. This video made the rounds about 2 years ago. And it's a light rail trolley on wheels. So you can essentially deploy this kind of medium mass transit without laying a track on existing roads. It's not really autonomous. I won't get into the details of it. It's more like that 1956 Motorama. It's just kind of following a painted line. But we imagined, what if this really could be done? Bus rapid transit, which is a great idea that swept the world, maxes out at about 50, give or take 50,000 people an hour on a bus rapid transit line. And part of it has to do with the fact that buses can only be about 3 coaches long. So we imagined in Sao Paulo, for this scenario, city that heavily depends on buses, what if we could chain individual buses together with software platooning, like they do with trucks, and turn them into trains. And again, we get to the idea of what can you do that's new, that's not just fixing what we have now. Maybe towards the end of the line, we have what transit people call dual mode operation, where one of the cars splits off and goes to a different place. This is something that's very hard to do with trains right now. But you could do it with bus rapid transit, or what we called software trains, very easily. There's all kinds of other little detailed benefits of automated buses. You can make them more comfortable. You know, you're not going to have a driver, like my bus driver, pardon me, who's just constantly punching the accelerator and punching the brake. Like, I almost think they're playing a game of dominoes to see how many people they can knock down in the aisle. And you can make narrower roadways for buses too. So you can reduce some of the opposition to bus rapid transit because you don't have to take as much land for it. This is a really interesting concept that was put forward by IDEO, design agency in California. It's basically, what if we took conference rooms and put them on wheels? IKEA also picked up on this idea and imagined, you know, what if we put doctors' offices in those and drove them around and parked them in places where people need health care and aren't getting enough of it. And so we imagined, you know, yet another vehicle type that we called Civic caravans. This is a riff on that idea for kind of a pop-up shop in Shanghai. But I really think that this is the civic architecture of the 21st century. Rather than going downtown to a big government building, a big expensive government building that's probably on some of the best land in your city, that those services should come to you and predictively come to you and your neighborhood. So, you know, imagine this is sort of like a fleet that moves around at night based on where those services are needed the most. And instead of, you know, just having one function, they might bring together specialists in health and education and family planning and whatever services are needed for you to have a one-stop shop in your neighborhood. And this is sort of taking the stigma of the government trailer and turning it into something glorious. And then the final future vehicle are what I call urban ushers. And just think, this is sort of where the dividing line between what's an automated vehicle and what's a robot in the real world starts to blur. And think of this basically as all the street furniture, all the traffic lights, parking meters, stop signs, anything that's a fixture on the street that serves a function, combined together in a single robot that essentially patrols and manages and provides, you know, monitors road usage, traffic safety, security, environmental monitoring, whatever it is that you need to do. This is from Hitachi in Japan, and it's kind of a corny version of it, but I like when it flaps its wings. Here's this guy having a heart attack, and somehow this little thing is going to save him. Maybe it has a defibrillator that it can like taser him and start his heart up again, but it is kind of ridiculous looking, but there it goes. Okay. We call this the penguin at work. Here's a more plausible idea. What if these things could make our streets programmable much more cheaply and dynamically than they are today? So you might book a block party and no human being would have to do anything, but 24 hours before that block party, the ushers show up and start routing people to other locations, either down other streets or other parking places. They may electronically be communicating with your smart vehicle or just showing you a sign. They can provide directions to tourists. They can help identify senior citizens who, you know, may have lost their way because of dementia. All kinds of possibilities. And another interesting thing about them is that they allow us to think about privacy in the smart city in a different way. Because if you have one of these moving around, you don't have to put video cameras up. You don't have to put sensors all over the place. You can just put them there, and it helps people understand, where I'm being monitored. I'm being monitored when I'm around these robots. So this is all speculation, but it's speculation based on what's happening in the labs, the prototypes that are being built, and filtering that through some of the things that cities want to achieve, in the near future. And that this isn't just about transportation. It's not just about moving the most people through a city. There's a whole bunch of other goals that cities are trying to achieve around mobility and more broadly with technology in the future. So with that, I think I will stop and we can turn to you guys and have a more open discussion and draw inspiration from this vision of future cities. I think it's on Mars. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. So welcoming to the stage Anthony and also Petrina Gentile, who, as I mentioned, is an automotive journalist who writes for the Drive section of the Globe and Mail. It covers the automotive beat on her bi-weekly automotive segment called Up to Speed on the CTV News Channel. Now, if you've got questions, start writing them now, and when you have one, hold it up. A volunteer, as you can see there, good. Here's one. A volunteer will come and fetch it from you, and they're going to feed Petrina. So great. Let's have more questions. In the meantime, they'll have a chat, just the two of them, and then they'll come back to you.
Thanks, Mary. And thank you for joining us tonight. It's great to see so many people here. That was very interesting. You gave us a lot to think about. I wanted to start off by asking you, first of all, when do you see this transformation taking place in our cities? Is it, 5 or 10 years down the road, or is it more like 30 years down the road?
So a lot of the things that I talked about are already happening. They're happening in manually driven, manually provided services like ride-hail. And what you can see in those startups and those kinds of services are companies trying to figure out what it is that people want other than driving their own automobiles that they own by themselves. And a lot of those successes will be mapped over into the world of automated vehicles. They'll just become profitable because a lot of them aren't really profitable right now. I think we're probably looking at like 20 years when you'll step out onto the corner and see an automated vehicle, guaranteed. They may not be all of the vehicles, but they will become commonplace. Of course, there'll be pockets where we experience that much earlier. If you go to Florida now, retirement communities are starting to invest in these. And people think you have to be young and hip to adopt technology, but like e-books, Kindles, senior citizens were the first to take advantage of that in big numbers. And now we all use them. So I think we're going to see some interesting pockets of adoption where, and there's certainly places like Singapore is going gung-ho on this. London and Paris are both trying to figure out ways to integrate this. If you go to Norway has embraced electric vehicles for a very long time. It's the only place in the world where you can get stuck in a traffic jam with Teslas because Teslas are allowed to use the HOV lane. So I think 20 years is probably the yardstick for big change. One generation.
So are we going to even own cars in the future? Or are we just going to use ride-hailing, ride-sharing services and these robo-buses?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's a question that everyone asks. If you work for a car company, you're definitely asking that question. You're seeing young people buy cars at a much lower rate than ever before. I mean, a lot of car makers have basically stopped making cheap entry-level cars for kids to buy. They only make, sort of the mid and upper. And so they're not even like training their next generation of customers. I think the upshot of it is that you'll have a choice. Owning your own car and driving it yourself will not be the only way to get around, particularly in North America, where we've built so much of our landscape around that way of traveling. There will be other choices, and one of those will be having a computer drive for you. The big question in my mind, there's a lot of excitement around sharing rides in robo-taxis, for lack of a better term. Yet, and from a transport planner's point of view or an environmentalist point of view, that's a great outcome. Like, get rid of all the private cars. There's robo-taxis at the press of a button for almost no money. That would radically change the world. It would reduce carbon emissions. The problem is only like 20 or 30% of people seem willing to share rides. And to get beyond that is probably going to require more than lowering the price. It's probably going to require coercion.
Well, I'm one of those examples.
Yes.
I mean, I make my living out of driving. I love driving. I don't use any ride-sharing services for a number of reasons.
Right.
I won't go into them. But how do you convince someone like me to use that ride-sharing? Is it a matter of, making the parking so expensive that when I'm going downtown Toronto, it's now costing me $50 to park, that will be the trigger to change my behavior?
Well, so I'm going to guess gender has a role to play in it. So part of the reason why we've overinflated expectations about ride sharing is because it's been mostly men doing the thinking and talking. And when I talk about fables of the driverless revolution, it's a lot of white, wealthy, older men engineers who have shaped these visions. And so a lot of what's happening now is a broader range of the public is starting to understand, okay, this is what technically is possible. Do we want that? Do we want something different? And if we want something different, what do we have to do to get it? So a lot of the questions are not going to come down to like, will we do this or will we do that? It'll be, what do we want? And then how do we make it happen? Because, this is incredibly flexible technology. I think the subtext of what I was trying to get across with that species explosion is we can make an AV to do whatever we want. I didn't show the wheelchairs, but Hitachi's working on self-driving wheelchairs. That could be the thing in the next 20 years that introduces us all to automated vehicles. And they won't even be going around outside. They'll be going around airports and hotels and resorts. I don't know, but I think we need to keep our options open and continuously chip away at the dominant framework of privately owned automobiles. There are going to be people and there are going to be occasions where we want to have private travel for all kinds of reasons, but it can't be the only choice, I think, going forward.
And there are certainly a lot of benefits, environmentally, people with mobility issues, for sure. But there are challenges, and one of them is consumer adoption when it comes to driverless cars. With recent fatalities and accidents with self-driving cars, consumers aren't necessarily willing to get into one. In fact, I think it was AAA that did a survey a couple months ago in the US, and they said something like 73% of people are not willing to get into a driverless car. So how do you get these people to adopt this technology?
I will say, though, as an association of motorists, it's in the AAA's interests
Absolutely.
to not let driverless technology survive another day, because I don't think they're going to be able to sell subscriptions and memberships to software. They might, but they're like labor unions. They need to keep the membership up. So automation is bad for them for the same reason it's bad for labor unions. I think the most exciting area is going to be these little personal vehicles. I forgot to mention it in the talk, but I call that category rovers. So anything that's like not something you get into, but something you get on, a scooter, a bike, a wheelchair, a one-wheel, a hoverboard. There's this thing, do you guys have this in Toronto? I call them skateboard gondoliers. They're people who ride really long skateboards and they use a hiking pole to push themselves along. This is like, you can see these things in Manhattan. It's a real form of transportation. So they might get automated. Those kinds of devices, first of all, they're slow enough and small enough that the safety risks are much lower. They're cheap to make, they're easy to change, and you can basically sell them like consumer electronics. And that completely throws the whole automotive supply chain out the window. The other area that I think is going to move forward really fast is freight. Another thing that does not require people to get into and activate the whole regulatory system, safety regulation around automobiles. And freight vehicles will be able to do crazy things that you can't do. They'll be able to go super fast and make high G turns, or go really, really, really slowly. So driving itself is something that's going to, fragment into different species. It's not just binary, like everything's human-driven, everything's computer-driven. There's this whole world in between that we're not even talking about that's going to arise when these different vehicles sort of roll out.
And let's talk about, the data and the privacy issues that come along with these automated vehicles. I mean, when you look at a driverless car, it has over 100 sensors all around it. It's capturing data about our driver behavior, where you're going, what routes you're taking. And this is really valuable to, a lot of companies. And if they want this information, I mean, should they be paying for it? Should we think of our data and our privacy as a product in the future?
So let me kind of wrap up all of my comments with one very simple, controversial forecast. Wealthy people will have private rides in computer-chauffeured cars, and they'll be able to sleep, shag, do whatever they want. They'll have total privacy. Poor people will have to ride around in shared vehicles so that they conserve road space and energy. And they'll have no privacy. That whole service may be subsidized just by your eyeballs, the value of your attention, the media and other services that you'll consume while you're basically inside a computer, driving around stuck in traffic. I mean, I think that's very, very plausible future. And it's a terrible one if we care about, it's a good one if we care about moving traffic and not having heavy-handed government regulation, but having markets regulate that, and potentially carbon as well. It's a terrible future if we care about equity, if we care about privacy, and if we care about, sort of social connectivity, what our host mentioned in the beginning. People having their attention focused outwards to the media web rather than towards each other, as they would maybe in public transit or walking.
So how do we change things? How do cities prepare for?
So I'll give a plug for Toronto, because I think Toronto at the city level has started working on this, thinking about these possibilities, trying to figure out plans and policies that would allow the city to prepare and potentially push some things forward faster than others and hold things back. And I've helped review some of these proposals this year, and I think there's going to be more coming from the city. So right now, Toronto is doing pretty much more than anybody else. That said, shouldn't stop, Toronto and Ontario and Canada from going the next step. And I think it's really going to be a process of engaging all these stakeholders, industry, big and small, NGOs, lay people who understand their travel needs better than anybody else, to figure out which this wide variety of things do we want. The challenge is not going to be predicting what's inevitably going to happen. It's going to be finding consensus about what you want to push forward. And I think Toronto's in a pretty good position right now to send some powerful signals to parts of the industry, certainly, that would respond if given the opportunity. And one of the things we did for Bloomberg was develop an online atlas of 150 cities that are doing automated vehicle pilots all around the world. So nobody has figured out how to do this well. And we're in a big learning phase right now.
Where does Canada rank in that global study?
I think pretty near the top, ahead of the United States for sure. We hadn't really articulated a good policy, and now I've had 2 years of basically let the industry write the policy, and that could continue. I think Asia, many parts of East Asia are moving really quickly, and Europe is integrating all of this into like some very comprehensive mobility frameworks. So, Canada's doing better than the U.S. I'll leave it at that.
All right, that's a good way to end it. I have a huge pile of questions for the
Yes.
audience, so I'm going to just jump right into it. And this sort of, leads on to one of the questions I asked earlier. Who will have access to the data that automated vehicles collect if these public services are designed by private companies?
Yeah.
Very important question.
Okay, so if you came here, I don't even know if there's here, I hope to God there is. If you came here on a bus, the bus is manufactured by a private company. I don't know how your bus operations work here, but if you're in, say, London, with a great public transit organization, the bus is operated by a private contractor. So even when we talk about public mobility services, public transit, this is a really complicated question. If you're in a vehicle that was made by a car company, you're screwed. If you're in a vehicle that's operated by a ride-hail company, totally screwed. They are going to harvest and mine that data to whatever limit they're legally entitled to. And as we've seen with a lot of these companies, probably go beyond that until they get caught. And then probably go beyond that until they get penalized enough to make it hurt. We can't even impose like basic antitrust kinds of restrictions on these companies. In Singapore, in SoftBank, the Japanese investor that basically has monopolized all the ride-hail businesses around the world, bought Uber. They didn't buy them, but they basically took Uber over. And they pulled Uber out of Singapore, which left one company providing e-taxi services in Singapore. The Singaporean government issued the largest fine they've ever issued to a private company. And it was like, 8 hours worth of revenue. So I don't see like a very good, it's going to be very difficult. But I think that these personal vehicles are going to be where we might see some different models, and we'll see companies take a different attitude. Physically, they'll be able to detect less when you're on a scooter instead of inside a vehicle, but their operating costs are so low, they probably won't have to harvest the data in order to break even. And there's just going to be so many more of them that they'll be able to try business models that don't require them to do that.
I'm going to share a story really quickly about a vehicle. It was a vehicle launch I was on, and it was Mercedes A-Class in Croatia last year. And it was really interesting because I was testing out the AI system, the artificial intelligence. So it has like what would be equivalent to Alexa in your car. Mm-hmm. And we're driving along, very impressive. You say, oh, hey, Mercedes, I'm cold, and it raises the temperature by 1 degree. Now, the product guys told us, this can understand different languages. So as I'm driving along, I'm, asking it things in Italian because I'm Italian, and of course, doesn't understand me. My co-driver's Portuguese. He's asking questions in Portuguese, doesn't understand him. And we're just kind of laughing and giggling, amongst ourselves. And all of a sudden, the car kind of, harassed us in a way. It actually said to us, now, be nice. And I have to tell you, it freaked me out. I completely forgot this car was listening to my private conversation, and I didn't say another word.
Were you cursing, or?
No, we were just laughing. We were just like, oh, this, she doesn't understand our dialects, and so we were just making comments like that. But
or worse yet, it heard you speaking a foreign language and thought you were being profane.
Maybe.
We have so many cases in the transportation sector now of AI making really biased mistakes. Mm-hmm. There have been some early indications that the computer vision systems that are used in a lot of AVs see people with dark skin differently than people with light skin. And there's more than anecdotal evidence that's because they were tested on a non-representative sample of the population. And so the whole system calibrated itself around the assumptions of the people that made it, which were not representative. future's just more of that unless we find ways to police it or put more ethics education in engineering, which is virtually non-existent right now. These are like society-wide things that I think this technology is going to be the front lines. I mean, this is really the technology that most people are going to encounter AI in their everyday lives in a way that matters, that starts to steer their life chances in different directions. Because whether you can get access to jobs or education or healthcare is everything, and this technology will be the thing pulling the levers on how you get moved through those systems.
I have another question here, and this I know is a loaded one. How are insurance companies dealing with the question of liability of autonomous vehicles? Who is at fault?
Yeah, I don't think that much about AV safety, which sounds stupid. In my book, the part that I deal with about regulation and policy is actually the financial industry. I'm much more scared of the people on Wall Street than I am of the people in Silicon Valley. Like, Silicon Valley people will do harm by accident. They want the thing to work. People in Wall Street will do harm on purpose because it's very profitable. So, I think that the business models that automated vehicles and the financial shenanigans that they'll enable when we plug all these vehicles into markets are frightening. The safety issue, people tell me in the industry that if AVs are not demonstrably safer than human drivers, there will not be an AV industry. So it's almost like a self-regulating problem. I don't believe that means we shouldn't have safety regulation for AVs, but it makes sense. And what it highlights to me is the seriousness and the urgency around that. As far as insurance companies, this is like a windfall for them, because all of that data that's tracking our activities, our movements, can be used to sell us ever new kinds of risk mitigation. Risks we didn't even know we were taking when we were in vehicles. Do you want to be insured against high G turns in your self-driving vehicle? Do you want to be insured against, rides not showing up in time and being late for work? So the idea that more data will allow more insurance services and products to be created. Think about all the things that you can now buy insurance when you shop online, right? Like my flight up here, $50. Do you want cancellation insurance? The ticket was like $300. Like, what am I saving? And I think that's just going to continue.
And Tesla's even offering their own insurance this month.
Yes.
Where they're going to look at the data from the autopilot system to determine if you drive aggressively, you're going to pay more. So it's interesting how they're using that data right now as we speak.
Yeah, I think TLDR is that like risk is a matter of perception, and more data will allow more risks to be detected and communicated.
Now I have another question. Do you see the rich being sold a premium service so that they can bypass traffic and traffic lights will be programmed to their favor?
Yes, I think I brought that up already. Let me throw another scenario out that scares me. Manhattan, where I work, is very, very difficult to get into at rush hour. We have lots of buses, delivery vans, they're bringing in paintings. We just sold, artwork. We just sold a piece of art at auction for $180 million in Manhattan the other day. So when we're in a world of automated vehicles that can bid against each other for the right to drive through that tunnel to get into Manhattan, do you think that the informal van full of housekeepers is going to be able to outbid the freight van bringing that $180 million painting into Manhattan? I don't think so. So I think we're going to end up in a situation where it isn't just rich and poor people competing, it's rich people's stuff will be competing with poor people for access to roads. And that's like an absolutely horrifying proposition, whatever policy it is you care about: environment, transportation, equity.
Okay. What does this automated revolution mean for society in terms of social sustainability? Example, jobs lost in automation, social isolation?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think more mobility has a potential to isolate people. We've seen a lot of that. I think it has more to do with the land use patterns that we built up around the automobile. But more mobility, I think, is like more communications. It gives people the opportunity to connect. And from, I think, like a general point of view, that's a good thing. And to the extent that these technologies bring more mobility and more specialized, tailored kinds of mobility that don't force us to compromise because cars are the cheapest, most ubiquitous thing, I think it'll be good. I think it'll allow people to associate more and to access more jobs and more services.
Now, how long is the overlap between people-driven cars and autonomous cars? Is there a tipping point?
Yeah.
And I'm assuming level 5?
I think, again, it depends on what is the automated vehicle that breaks out first. If it's passenger automobiles, I think people are saying 20 to 30 years. But if we all, move into dense neighborhoods and drive around on e-scooters, or we decide it's in our interests, whether it's for climate change or because we want to take the streets back for open space to make it convenient for everyone to get on self-driving buses, that could take 50 years. I don't know. It's an inherently unpredictable future. But I think we need to pick one and push towards it.
How would you fit mobile vehicles into cities that, out of necessity, due to population growth and limited space, need to go up rather than out? Drones are very loud and intrusive. And I want to add to that, flying cars. You didn't touch on that.
Yeah.
We know that Boeing and Airbus, they're testing their own versions of flying taxis.
So any country in the world, if you want to meet the most risk-averse people, the aviation regulators, they are going to slow pedal drones in cities and any kind of flying things in cities as long as they possibly can. That said, there won't be special uses where, I think after emergencies, we're going to want cities filled with drones because they'll be able to do all kinds of things. Guide evacuations, assess damage, deliver emergency supplies and medicines. I imagine what would have happened in Puerto Rico last year if we had had 1 million drones to drop in there, minutes after the wind died down. That said, I think cities have to start preparing for drones now. And noise is probably the biggest issue. Even if they're totally safe and cheap, and people at Carnegie Mellon now believe that it will be less carbon intensive to move goods over the last mile by drone than by truck, people will not like the noise. And so if you want to mitigate that noise, you basically have to start planting more trees now so that in 20, 30 years we have a mature canopy that the drones can fly over and hopefully will be shielded from some of the noise. And these are the kinds of crazy crash landing zones for drones will be absolutely necessary. And where are we going to put those? We basically would have to rope off some part of the city on every block for crash landing zones for drones. And not a single street design of the future, not Sidewalk Labs or anybody else has thought about where we're going to put that.
That's a very good point. Now, what is the biggest challenge yet to be solved for autonomous vehicles, level 5, no driver behind the wheel?
Finding a customer. Yeah. I don't think anybody wants to buy them yet. And this is just kind of flummoxed the car companies because what they do best is manufacture lots and lots of identical cars. So that's a long and rocky road ahead, I think, finding out why someone would want to buy it.
How will the future of urban mobility be shaped by 5G technology?
This is interesting. I have a real bone to pick with the use of the term autonomous because these vehicles will actually be the most not independent, most infrastructure-dependent transportation system we've ever built. They depend on GPS. They depend on incredibly detailed maps that have been gathered and delivered over the cloud as they drive along. And 5G will be absolutely essential to this. Building out the 5G network in North America will be as large an infrastructure project as the interstates and national road network in Canada. This is like a generational thing. To date, it's been financed by private capital, and that will probably continue, but there are some pieces of it that the public sector are going to have to help catalyze or potentially help subsidize, or find clever ways to get consumers to pay for, because there's really no other way that it's going to happen.
Okay. Is there a danger of autonomous vehicles reducing the cost of transport, resulting in more traffic jams?
That's the default setting. That's the flip side of the coin. More mobility is good. These things are going to unleash what they call latent demand for travel, the likes of which we've never seen. And that's sort of the dark underbelly of, Google's putting 500,000 visually impaired Californians on the road. There's no room in California for them on the road. Where are they going to go? All of a sudden, and it's a very difficult thing. And I think what's happened thus far is it's mostly transportation experts have dominated the discussion. And they look at that and they say that we can't let that happen. Meanwhile, you have the advocates for disabled people saying, this is our number one priority and we want to partner with the auto industry to make this possible. And balancing those objectives and opportunities and constraints is just going to be incredibly difficult going forward. There are all kinds of detailed ways of threading the needle on that involve transit and involve things like congestion pricing. But it's really, really difficult societal choice. And it's all going to, sort of set the limits on how far we can get on things like climate mitigation and housing affordability, and all the other issues. Transportation is what connects everything together.
Now, okay, what about taking off the rose-colored glasses and talking about the opposite of all these shiny, glamorous ideas? I like this question. Yeah. Urban sprawl, increased traffic, battle for the curb, hacking and weaponizing, and there are a couple others as well.
Yeah, I think those are all things that could be made worse by this technology. Sprawl is certainly... I deal with this myself. I grew up in a small town 3 hours away from New York City that you can only get to by car. And I would go there more if I could press the button and go to sleep or do it in the middle of the night. And I think about that fondly. I often catch myself late at night watching what I call Tesla porn, which is YouTube videos of dash cams of people's Teslas avoiding crashes that would have killed them. There's like millions of hours of footage of this. And every time I sit there and I watch it, I find myself over on the Tesla site filling out the financing application, which as an urbanist I know is putting the nail in the coffin of this planet, regardless of whether it's an electric vehicle, and imposing costs on all my neighbors by the traffic that I'll create. So I think if I'm this conflicted about it, I think millions of people who are less trained and less knowledgeable and maybe have different sense of values and ethics are going to be conflicted too. And so the way I've been thinking about this in the U.S. is we need to build new towns. There's a whole bunch of reasons why the U.S. needs to build new towns anyway. We have to accommodate a lot of people if we don't close the border. And they can't all fit into existing cities. They could, but it won't happen. So we're going to have to build new towns, potentially hundreds or thousands of them. And they shouldn't be sprawly and auto-centric. They should be compact and AV-centric. And I think that's where, all these questions like, what do we do at curbs? And what's the right density to try to build around AV technologies that are coming? Where's the land to do this? And how should we think about what land we take and what land we keep undeveloped? I think it's very quickly going to get wrapped up in a bigger discussion about land use and climate change.
And there's also the issue, as you mentioned, of hacking. We saw a Jeep that was hacked a couple of years ago for Wired magazine where, for a story, they remotely hacked a Jeep and were able to, apply the brakes, turn on the windshield wipers, accelerate, all remotely. Is that something that we should fear in the future?
Yes, and I think frankly, we need to think about technology-infused cities and districts and societies as something that come with a lot of large-scale, long-term liabilities, the same way we would look at a factory or an incinerator. And so one of the ideas that batting around with some colleagues is, what's the environmental impact assessment for, say, something like Sidewalk Labs, like a big land use proposal in a city that wants to change the rules for how everything works and use these technologies that we haven't yet finished inventing and don't really understand their long-term consequences to run. And cybersecurity, to me, beyond privacy, is the one that should trigger important people in all walks of life and levels of government to say, yes, let's do that. Let's stop everything and really figure out what could go wrong, the same way we would do an environmental impact assessment, and then develop a strategy to mitigate it, and then hold people and institutions accountable for mitigating all those risks, because it's just going to get worse. I could spend a whole night, just scraping the surface of all the scary things that are going on right now.
All right, I'm going to take one more question because we're running out of time. While there are multiple prototypes across vehicles, how ready is government to accept the changes and make autonomous a standard?
So I don't know if that will happen. I think what government needs to do is tell the industry, these are the outcomes that we want. And I wouldn't define those outcomes if we want this technology to be perfected and everyone to have it, the way we sort of did with the automobile. What they should say is, we want mobility that performs at this level of carbon output, hopefully zero, hopefully negative, at this level of safety, that this many people have access to at this share of their income, and helps us achieve our other goals of more compact, more sustainable, more equitable communities, which I think is kind of what everybody wants, and to do it at a reasonable cost. Those are the messages that government needs to send. And we're seeing a bunch of cities. Toronto's one that's doing that, Seattle, Singapore, London, and they're starting to do it together as well, but we need to see it at higher levels of government too. Higher levels of government all around the world basically think this is a new auto industry for the 21st century. And it's not. It's a bunch of different industries that provide mobility, and making vehicles is just one tiny little part of it going forward.
Yep, you're absolutely right. Thank you so much for that, and thank you for your amazing questions. That was fantastic. I'm going to invite Mary back onto the stage.